know why I stopped you tonight?
No, officer, I was driving within the limit.
Do you consent to a search of the vehicle?
I do not consent to any searches.
The flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the rearview mirror didn't scare Marcus. What made his stomach instantly tighten was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the officer's boots approaching the window, carrying a predetermined assumption that was already etched in stone. It was dusk in the downtown corridor, that fleeting, shadowy hour when the city's sharp edges blur into a haze of neon and street lamps. The air was cooling fast, settling heavy over the damp pavement. Inside the upscale steakhouse they had just left, the atmosphere had been a symphony of calculated wealth, the clatter of heavy silver against imported ceramic, the low murmur of high-stakes negotiations, the sharp hiss of an espresso machine cutting through the ambient jazz. Marcus and his colleague, David, had spent the last 4 hours in a corner booth, fueled by black coffee and half-eaten ribeyes, tearing apart the opposing counsel's deposition for a grueling corporate litigation case. Marcus, at 34, was a junior partner known for his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that had lost its crispness somewhere around hour 12 of their workday. David, 40, and a senior associate, was more relaxed, a man who had long ago learned to leave the anxiety of the courtroom at the office door. They were exhausted, their brains entirely depleted of anything resembling casual conversation. When they finally stepped out of the restaurant and into the crisp autumn air, the silence between them was a shared, comfortable relief. Their footsteps echoed hollowly against the concrete of the parking garage as they approached Marcus's car. Unlike his peers who leased luxury sedans to signal their success, Marcus drove a meticulously maintained but undeniably dated 2014 dark gray Honda Accord. He was frugal, paying off his law school debt with a quiet, relentless discipline, and he felt a lingering sentimental attachment to the car that had gotten him through the late nights of studying for the bar exam. The heavy doors of the Honda slammed shut with a muffled thud, sealing them inside the quiet cabin. Marcus turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life with a familiar, steady hum. He guided the car out of the structure and onto the avenue, the streetlights flickering to life above them with a faint electrical buzz. Traffic was light. The radio was turned off, leaving only the sound of the tires rolling over the asphalt and the rhythmic, clicking cadence of the turn signal as Marcus navigated the one-way streets. He slowed as they approached a yellow light, bringing the car to a smooth, complete stop behind the thick white line of the crosswalk. There was no screech of brakes, no sudden movements. It was an entirely unremarkable moment on an unremarkable Tuesday evening. But as the light turned green and Marcus eased his foot onto the accelerator, a patrol cruiser pulled out from a dark side street, its tires chirping briefly against the pavement. The cruiser fell in behind the Honda, maintaining a precise, unblinking distance for 3 blocks. Marcus noticed it immediately. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. He checked his speedometer. He was driving 28 in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. His registration was current. His taillights were fully functional. He said nothing to David, not wanting to manufacture anxiety out of thin air, but his grip on the leather steering wheel tightened slightly. Then the cruiser's light bar erupted. The interior of the Honda was instantly bathed in strobing, violent flashes of crimson and sapphire. The short, authoritative whoop of the siren shattered the quiet of the car. David sighed heavily, rubbing his eyes, assuming it was a random check or a broken bulb. Marcus engaged his right blinker, pulled smoothly to the curb beneath a flickering amber streetlight, and shifted the car into park. The ambient noise of the city seemed to fade away, replaced entirely by the deep, idle rumble of the police cruiser behind them and the harsh crackle of a two-way radio spitting static into the night air. Marcus rolled down his window completely, placed both hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions, and waited. He could hear the heavy creak of a leather duty belt The distinct crunch of thick-soled boots on the loose gravel of the gutter and the faint jingling of keys, Officer Hayes walked with the slow, deliberate swagger of a 15-year veteran who believed he had seen everything the city had to offer. He was a man who trusted his gut more than his training manual, a habit that had served him well in his early years but had slowly calcified into a rigid, dangerous complacency. He approached the driver's side, stopping just behind the B-pillar of the car so that Marcus had to turn his head awkwardly over his left shoulder to see him. Hayes shone a high-lumen mag light directly into the cabin. The blinding beam swept over Marcus's face, lingered unnecessarily on his unfastened collar, darted across the center console, and settled on David in the passenger seat, license, registration, and proof of insurance. Hayes demanded. His voice was a flat, gravelly baritone, devoid of the standard customer service politeness usually required in modern policing. There was no good evening. No explanation for the stop. Certainly, officer, Marcus replied, his voice calm, measured, and entirely devoid of irritation. My wallet is in my right back pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now. Hayes didn't respond, keeping the beam of the flashlight pinned to Marcus's hands as they moved slowly and deliberately. The rustle of paper and the soft snap of a leather wallet were the only sounds until Marcus handed the documents out the window. Hayes snatched them, briefly glancing at the plastic card before shining the light back into Marcus's eyes. Do you know why I stopped you tonight? Marcus Hayes asked, using the driver's first name in a deliberate, subtle assertion of dominance. I don't, officer. I was maintaining the speed limit and made sure to signal my turns. Marcus said, squinting slightly against the glare. You made a wide right turn back there on 4th and Elm. Hayes stated, and your vehicle matches the description of a suspect involved in a commercial burglary 2 miles from here. Marcus frowned slightly, his analytical mind instantly catching the discrepancy. A wide right turn was a minor traffic infraction, usually resulting in a warning, but the leap to a commercial burglary suspect was an entirely different legal universe. I apologize if my turn was wide, officer, but I can assure you we have nothing to do with any burglars. We just left the steakhouse on 5th Street. Hayes let out a short, dismissive scoff. The sound was sharp in the quiet night. He leaned in closer, his forearm resting on the roof of the Honda. The faint smell of stale coffee and mint gum wafted into the car. Right? The steakhouse. You boys looking a little out of your element for a place like that. Aren't you? Where are you coming from before that? Whose car is this? It's my car. The registration matches my license. Marcus said, his tone dropping half an octave, the professional courtesy beginning to harden into something more guarded. And we were at the restaurant working on what Hayes pressed, his tone shifting from inquisitive to openly skeptical. He was looking at the slightly wrinkled suits, the older model car, the general exhaustion on their faces, and his brain was filling in the gaps with a narrative of his own design. We are attorneys. Marcus said simply, we were preparing for a deposition. The silence that followed was thick and palpable. From the passenger seat, David shifted uncomfortably, the leather seat creaking. Outside, a solitary car drove past, the whoosh of its tires breaking the quiet before fading down the block. Hayes looked from Marcus to David, then back to Marcus. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was the look of a man who believed he had just caught a liar in a clumsy trap. Attorneys, Hayes repeated, drawing the word out slowly. Is that right? You're a lawyer. In a 10-year-old Honda, dressed like you slept in those suits. Yes, officer, we're with Reynolds and Vance downtown. Marcus replied, keeping his hands visible on the wheel. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. He knew the psychology of a traffic stop. He knew that the moment ego entered the equation, the law often went out the window. Sure, you are, Hayes muttered. Stepping back from the door, step out of the vehicle. Marcus froze. The dynamic of the encounter had just crossed a critical, invisible boundary. Officer, am I receiving a citation for the wide turn? I said, step out of the vehicle. Hayes commanded, his voice rising. His hand instinctively resting on the radio clipped to his chest, though not yet dropping to his duty weapon. You're acting nervous. You're being evasive. I'm going to conduct a search of the vehicle. Marcus didn't move. He looked straight ahead through the windshield, his mind racing through case law, statutes, and constitutional precedents. He took a slow, deep breath, regulating his heart rate. When he spoke, his voice was the exact same controlled, authoritative tone he used when addressing a federal judge. Officer, under Pennsylvania v. Mims, you have the right to order me out of the vehicle for officer safety. I will comply with that order, Marcus said, unbuckling his seatbelt with a loud click. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the biting evening air. He was a few inches taller than Hayes, which seemed to irritate the officer further. Marcus closed the door behind him and stood calmly by the wheel. However, Marcus continued, you do not have my consent to search this vehicle. A wide turn is a minor traffic infraction. You have not articulated any reasonable, objective suspicion that I am armed and dangerous to justify a Terry frisk of the vehicle, nor do you have probable cause to believe evidence of a crime is inside. Prolonging a traffic stop without independent reasonable suspicion is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights under Rodriguez v. Seffens. United States. Hayes stared at him. The ambient buzz of the streetlights seemed to grow louder. The officer's face tightened in genuine anger. He wasn't used to being lectured on the side of the road. And he certainly wasn't used to suspects citing Supreme Court precedents with flawless accuracy. But rather than taking a moment to reassess the situation, Hayes' pride doubled down. His internal bias, the assumption that these men were criminals trying to bluff their way out of a stop using television legal jargon, overrode his training. Don't play street lawyer with me. Buddy, Hayes snapped, stepping into Marcus's personal space. I told you, you match the description of a bolo. That gives me probable cause. Now, stand on the curb. You two, passenger, out of the car. David exited the vehicle quietly, his face pale, standing shoulder to shoulder with Marcus on the concrete sidewalk. They watched as Hayes, entirely dismissing Marcus's clear, articulated refusal, opened the driver's side door and began to rummage through the car. The sound of it was sickeningly intimate, the clatter of the glove compartment being yanked open, the rustle of confidential legal files being shoved carelessly aside, the thud of the center console lid slamming shut. Every sound was a hammer blow to the concept of civil liberties. Marcus watched in complete silence. He didn't yell. He didn't pull out his phone to record. He knew the cruiser's dash cam was running, and he could see the blinking red light of the body camera mounted squarely on Hayes' chest. The evidence was recording itself. For 10 agonizing minutes, the two lawyers stood shivering on the curb while Hayes dismantled the interior of the Honda. The officer checked beneath the floor mats, shone his light under the seats, and sifted through the trunk. He found nothing. No stolen goods, no weapons, no contraband, only a spare tire, a pair of jumper cables, and 3 heavy binders filled with dry, heavily redacted corporate financial records. When Hayes finally emerged from the vehicle, his demeanor had changed. The aggressive certainty was gone, replaced by a sullen, simmering frustration. He walked back to the curb, his boots dragging slightly. He shoved the license and registration back into Marcus's chest. Make sure you fix your driving. We're keeping an eye out. Hayes muttered, refusing to make eye contact. He turned and walked back to his cruiser without another word, without issuing a warning or a citation. The encounter was over, but it wasn't over. The turning point didn't happen on the side of the road. With a dramatic screaming match, it happened 3 days later in the soundproof conference room of Reynolds and Vance. Marcus had not let the incident go. Utilizing the full weight of his firm's resources, he had filed a formal complaint and submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the dash cam, the body cam, and crucially, the dispatch audio from the night of the stop. The evidence was played out of a high fidelity laptop speaker in the center of a mahogany table. Marcus, David, and a senior civil rights partner sat in silence, listening. First came the dispatch audio, crackling with static. The dispatcher's voice was clear and undeniable. All units, be on the lookout for a commercial burglary suspect in the downtown area. Suspect is believed to be driving a heavily modified late model black SUV with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. Marcus paused the audio. He looked at the senior partner, a dark gray, 10-year-old, four-door Honda sedan with standard glass and local plates. It wasn't a minor discrepancy. It was an entirely different reality. Hayes hadn't stopped Marcus because he matched the description. Hayes had heard the words burglary suspect and downtown. And when he saw an older, modest car driven by a man who didn't fit his prejudiced visual profile of a wealthy downtown professional, his mind filled in the blanks. The probable cause was a complete fabrication born from a subtle but profound bias. The real consequences began to unfold, not in a courtroom, but in the sterile, fluorescent lit office of Chief of Police Miller. Miller was a pragmatic man, nearing retirement, who spent more time managing liability than chasing criminals. He sat at his heavy steel desk, watching the body cam footage on his monitor. He listened to the clear, precise cadence of Marcus's voice as he asserted his rights. He listened to the citation of Rodriguez v. United States, and then he watched his veteran officer, a man with a file full of borderline complaints, completely disregard the law in favor of his own ego. Miller didn't feel anger. He felt a deep, exhausting disappointment. He knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a blatant, indefensible Fourth Amendment violation caught on high-definition video, perpetrated against a man who possessed the exact legal arsenal required to tear the department apart in federal court. When Officer Hayes was called into the chief's office later that afternoon, there was no shouting. The room was deathly quiet. Save for the hum of the HVAC vent, Miller turned the monitor around so Hayes could see his own face, distorted by the wide-angle lens. Aggressively leaning into Marcus's window, "Do you know who you pulled over?" Hayes Miller asked, his voice low and devoid of emotion. Hayes swallowed hard. Shifting his weight, the bravado from the street was entirely gone. "I suspect, Chief." He made a wide turn. "He was acting suspicious. You pulled over Marcus Sterling. He's a partner at Reynolds and Vance. They handle civil rights litigation for the ACLU on retainer." Miller said, picking up a thick manila folder from his desk and letting it drop with a heavy final slap. "The dispatch called for a modified black SUV. You stopped a gray sedan. He explicitly denied consent, cited the correct case law. And you searched his vehicle anyway because you didn't like his tone, because you didn't believe a man who looked like him driving a car like that could possibly be a lawyer." Hayes opened his mouth to defend himself, to rely on the old excuses of officer safety and furtive movements, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the folder. He realized in that agonizing stretch of silence that his career, or at least the respect and authority he had built his identity around, was effectively over. There would be an internal affairs investigation. There would be a suspension without pay. There would likely be a civil suit that would name him personally, dragging his reputation through the public record. And the worst part, the part that gnawed at the pit of his stomach, was that he couldn't blame a hostile suspect or a violent altercation He had derailed his own life entirely by himself, undone by a quiet man sitting calmly behind a steering wheel, armed with nothing but the truth and the law. The justice was not swift or cinematic. It was a slow, administrative grinding. Hayes was placed on desk duty, stripped of his badge and gun, forced to answer phones in the basement while the investigation dragged on for months. The quiet murmurs of his colleagues, the sudden distance of his friends in the department, the eventual damning report from Internal Affairs, it was a steady erosion of a man who had forgotten that the badge was a responsibility, not a shield for his own unchecked assumptions. When a badge becomes an unquestioned substitute for the law, who is left to protect the innocent from those sworn to protect them? The true danger in a civilized society is not always the dramatic villain lurking in the shadows, but the slow, quiet corruption of authority by those who believe their assumptions are more powerful than the rights they are pledged to uphold.